What is up guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to Gran Turismo 7. Now we're going to continue on with the final of my update 1.48 car reviews. This is of course the Volvo V40. This was a car that was hanging around on elite car list for the longest time, which pretty much confirmed the inclusion of Volvo in Gran Turismo 7 at some point down the line. But how is this car after we've had such amazing bangers such as the Skyline GTS R and the likes of the 240e and Honda NSX GT500? Well, we'll get into that shortly, but we'll talk about the price point and stats for this car before we get into the full review. So of course this is the Volvo V40 T5R design from 2013. Displacement is 1984cc, it's an FF drivetrain layout, 210 brake horsepower, weighing a fairly heavy 1540 kilograms and is turbocharged. Price point of this car fairly low at 40,000 credits. Next up is going to be customization options. The likes of wide bodies as well as plenty of different aero is available for this car. You can pretty much customize it to your liking. Nothing is really off limits, but I think most people will probably head down the sort of TCR track based route, and that is probably the way that you should go with this car. There's some fairly awesome touring car looking builds for this available, plenty of liveries on offer and plenty of ways to go ahead and really make this car feel like your own. So no complaints in terms of the customization options, much more available than I originally expected. I thought this would be a pretty throwaway car when it came to being able to actually make it feel very personalized and turning that kind of road car to track car feeling on. But that is all there, so let's move on to the actual review of the car itself, and I'm just going to start it straight off that this is probably the most disappointing car of update 1.48. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but when it's up against the likes of the Skyline, the NSX, the other Volvo, the 240e, and the Honda Civic, there's pretty much no real room to make this feel any kind of special in comparison to what is four very good cars, which really do cover a massive wide range of different types of vehicles that came with update 1.48. So overall it's certainly not a bad car, but it's definitely made that bit worse by the fact that they also put the 240e in the same update as what is a fairly uninspired car in comparison, and obviously the likes of the Skyline, NSX and such really did kind of highlight the fact that this is probably the weakest of the bunch. There is really no denying that. However, let's talk about the car itself. Of course, first we're going to review the stock version and then we'll talk about the fully modified version as well. Now in terms of the stock version, I am pleasantly surprised just by how good this car is. However, it does have a few features that really kind of frustrate me when it comes to the way that this car is driven, and that is mainly the fact that it's an FF layout and weighing 1500 kilograms. It really is a fairly heavy car. However, that 210 brake horsepower really doesn't go to waste. It's much pokier than I originally assumed it would be. I honestly thought this was going to be a very slow car, and whilst it does struggle quite slightly in the more top end ranges, when it comes to throwing this absolute brick around the corners, it really does put out a decent amount of power. So whilst that top end is relatively low and quite uninspiring, it certainly does perform rather quite well through the more tight and twisty sections, and whilst it is a fairly heavy car, that 210 brake horsepower really isn't being totally wasted at all. It will quite happily launch itself out of corners, so acceleration fairly quite decent, brakes not too bad, nothing to really write home about, and handling, well, much better than expected. I would say in terms of the front wheel drive layout on this car, it is much better through the tight and twisty sections than a lot of other front wheel drive vehicles. To finish off the review, let's talk about the styling and the way that this car looks. I have to say that in terms of the interior, it's rather quite impressive. It's much smarter inside than I would say it is on the outside. From the outside, I honestly don't think this is really too much special. It very much looks like a daily commuter car, and I feel like no matter what you really do to it, unless you go for that really kind of wide body touring car look, you can't really make this car look too handsome. It's not necessarily a bad looking car, but I do feel like the older Volvos, whilst absolutely hideous at times, were just much more appealing. Again, it's rather quite curvy, it's a typically modern Volvo design, but it really isn't anything to write home about, so it kind of just does the job, and that's about it. So to finish off the stock version of the V40, again, little bit disappointing to be totally honest, and really was a bit slower on the top end than I originally expected, but still a car that is capable of taking on a fairly decent amount of tracks in the game. So let's have a look where this car ranks overall on our lap time leaderboard. It falls in the 500 pp category. As you can see, it comes in a fairly modest 8th place. It is beaten by the likes of the Skyline GTS R by a fair few seconds, as well as the likes of the Mercedes-Benz 190e, Lancer Evos, and so on and so forth. It does, however, beat the Chevy Chevelle, the Chevy Corvette C1, and the Plymouth XNR. So far, this is the lowest of the fairly modern vehicles that we've thrown around the game. And again, when it's almost beaten by the likes of the Chevy Chevelle, which in its standard form on its standard tyres was horrific, it's really nothing to write home about. However, of course, we are not done there just yet. Of course, we're going to talk about the fully upgraded version. Whilst this car does get massively improved with upgrades, I do still feel that my complaints about the way the car feels in terms of its top end and such all still remain. So some of the downsides, such as the low top end speed and of course that extra weight that seems to be present on this car, are absolutely still there. Even with the likes of weight reduction, I'm happy to report that the handling gets even better, and that is certainly the strong point of this car. Overall though, it's still a relatively boring car to drive. When we've driven the likes of the Skyline and of course the 240e recently, it feels a little bit soulless and a little bit lifeless. However, it does still make for a rather quite decent track build, and honestly that is the way that I would definitely say you need to go down when it comes to the V40. For my recommendation, I would fully recommend going down the TCR touring car route in terms of building this car up. That is where the sort of sweet spot is. You're keeping a modest amount of top speed, a fairly decent amount of acceleration, throwing as much weight out as possible, and really focusing and fine-tuning the handling for this car. That is where this car really does come into its own, but as mentioned, it's quite a safe bet overall and a rather uninspiring drive. There's certainly other cars that you can have a lot more fun with the same drivetrain layout and so on and so forth, but overall it's not a bad car, it's just very much an average vehicle. Again, when it's surrounded by the cars that have been upgraded in this update, things like the Skyline, the Civic, and of course the 240e, this one really just struggles to shine overall. Whilst it's a fairly solid car all around, it will certainly be beat in pretty much every aspect by something just much better. So in terms of the lap time for the fully upgraded version, let's head over and have a look. This falls in the 700 pp category, pretty much like everything else with this update. As you can see, the slowest car of this update is now confirmed as the 240 SE, which is a 119-210. That is very much an obvious one to do. The engine swap Civic does come top, and the Volvo does actually end up third. It is still slower than the Skyline GTS-R from 1987. That one did surprise me quite a bit. So again, it's just a fairly bang average car, and I think that's where my final thoughts with this vehicle are going to lay. It's a fairly average car. It's not amazing at anything, it's not really that bad at anything. Overall, it just sits in this very middle space, and for me, it's the most disappointing car of update 1.48. But maybe you guys have a different opinion. Do let me know in the comments down below. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day and a great weekend. Take care, guys. Peace.